Why don't we get started? Welcome everyone. I'm Pat Kinney, and I'm joined by my colleagues Gaurab Basu, Heather Clifford, Zachary Popp, Rachel Nethery, and Amrita Nori Sarma. We will be for the next few hours walking through a sort of a demo educational session related to climate and health. We're going to start off. Myself and Gaurab will talk a little bit broadly about how climate change affects, and also how we can take action to help solve that problem. We'll then transition into a session led by Heather, who will talk to us about climate data, accessing it, processing it, and especially visualizing it. And then for the last bit, Rachel and Amrita will lead us through an example of a data analysis that uses typical code and also sort of data sets that are very commonly used in the climate and health field, just to give a feel for that kind of analysis. I think in general, this session probably targeted primarily at relatively new investigators in this arena, but we welcome anyone who's interested to take part. There's an opportunity to submit questions in the chat and probably in the Q&A as well, and those will be tracked by our colleagues. Let me move to the next slide, bro. Thank you. So the first bit is a session we're going to call Climate and Health Impacts and Solutions. And I'll start off, and then I'll pass it off to my colleague Gaurab in a few moments. Next slide, please. So this slide helps remind me that first of all, that our atmosphere is a thin layer that separates us from the void, and the void is large, and we have to think of our atmosphere as a very precious resource. And also, it's sort of the global nature of this issue can be overwhelming, but also reminds me too that as we mobilize to address climate and from a health perspective, we have a lot of tools already in our toolbox to start solving this problem. And I hope we'll give you a flavor for that today. Next slide. This is a chart that I just downloaded recently from NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, showing the average global temperatures from the time when data become reliably available in the late 1800s till 2023. These are just averages. You notice there's a lot of variability from year to year, but look at that trend that's so apparent starting around 1960 or 1970, with a rapid rise in global average temperatures that's actually been accelerating in the last couple of decades, with 2023 being the hottest year on record on a global basis. Next slide. We talk a lot about average temperatures, 1 degree, 2 degrees, that sort of thing. It doesn't maybe sound like a lot, but when we keep in mind that there's a distribution of temperatures, and it's often the extremes, especially at the high end, that really drive health impacts. And this could be true not only for temperatures, but also for precipitation and storm events. And so shifting the average of a distribution just a little bit to the right side ends up increasing the weight in the upper tails quite substantially. And this is illustrated from this little schematic plot of a normal distribution, where the amount of the number of days that fall into a hot category, however we wish to define that, nearly double with just a slight shift in the mean. Next slide. And it's not just about temperature, it's also about changes in the entire Earth system, including sea level rise, larger coastal storms. Next slide. Inland storms that drive migration and potential conflict. Next slide. Extended droughts that affect people's livelihoods, especially in agriculture, and people that live close to the land around the world, causing real problems with food security. And next slide, and it's all related also to air pollution. This is a picture showing particularly hazy day in Beijing a few years ago. So moving on to the next slide. Thanks, Gaurab. We're fortunate to have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which every 5 years or so does a big global assessment with the world's leading scientists that work on climate change, assessing the evidence. And the most recent report, which came out in the last year or two, came out, gave us these important conclusions. And the first one is the strongest, most unequivocal statement that's ever been made by the IPCC about the fact that human activities, principally through greenhouse gas emissions, have unequivocally caused global warming. And those emissions, based on the evidence we have, continue to increase, but with unequal historical and ongoing contributions, as we'll see. And that has resulted in rapid changes in the atmosphere, the ocean, the cryosphere, the biosphere, which has led to widespread adverse impacts to nature and people. And vulnerable communities who have historically had the least responsibility for the current change in climate are most disproportionately affected, which really makes this a global environmental justice problem, on a huge scale. And then finally, although we are hoping as a global community to keep our change in temperature below 1.5 or 2 degrees, right now, as a globe, we're on the track by the end of the century to reach 3.2 degrees Celsius. Thank you. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just to give a sense of what parts of our culture and economic systems are most responsible. This is a chart showing global contributions to greenhouse gases across different sectors of the economy. You see that electricity production and also food, agriculture, and land use and transportation industry are responsible for the bulk of this. These pie pieces will differ in different countries, but this global picture gives us a pretty good idea of what's responsible for the climate change that we're observing. Next slide. And if we track greenhouse gas emissions, in this case is fossil CO2 emissions charted from 1990 to the present time, we see a gradual upward trend, although there is evidence of a leveling off on a global basis. There are, including some important dips during financial crises and the COVID pandemic. And then that's right, you can go on to the next one, it's fine. Yeah. And we're not all equally responsible. It's particularly the developed world, in particular the United States, historically, it's had the largest share of cumulative CO2 emissions that are responsible for the climate change that we're observing. China's catching up rapidly, and many other developed countries as well. Next slide. What does this mean for the future? Climate scientists who contribute in part to the IPCC reports, and I think I definitely got this chart from the most recent report. They have models that can project the future based on different assumptions about how we as a global community take action now to mitigate or reduce the emissions of greenhouse gas. And you can see that even under the most optimistic scenario, if we get to the 1.5 degree sort of max change, and I think use the right hand y-axis, which shows the temperature changes relative to pre-industrial times. So there we can sort of track the 1 to 1.5 to 2 degree changes. And the most optimistic scenario that's examined by IPCC, even there, we expect further warming to occur by mid-century. And so the trajectory we're on right now of extreme storms and extreme heat waves is only going to get worse. It may start to get better if we're effective in controlling greenhouse gases by the end of the century. But some of the other scenarios, like the one that we're currently on, which is sort of in the middle part, gets us up to about 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Next slide. And I just wanted to mention that that was temperature. Sea level rise is a much more difficult beast to control because of the inertia in the ocean system. And so even under the most optimistic future scenarios, sea level will continue to rise through the end of the century and beyond. So I think that points, as health scientists, I think increasingly this century, we're going to be dealing more and more with trying to understand the health impacts of extreme coastal storm events, which are already major sources of ill health, but will only get worse for quite some time. Next slide. Turning to solutions to the climate crisis, we really have two approaches. There's mitigation, which refers to reducing emissions of greenhouse gases or enhancing the sinks to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And then secondly, adaptation, which are measures to reduce vulnerability of our systems to the ongoing climate change. And we need to do both. We want to get ourselves on a low future trajectory through mitigation, but we also realize that the climate's already changing quite rapidly, and therefore we have to adapt, and we will continue to need to adapt throughout this century and beyond. Next slide. So how can we as public health researchers inform these critical climate solutions? Well, using epidemiology, risk assessment, and also basic science, we can first quantify the magnitude of current and future climate-related health impacts, which can provide a fuller understanding of the adverse effects of climate change. We can also identify, prioritize, and evaluate effective adaptation strategies using that kind of evidence, and also evaluate and prioritize the health co-benefits of mitigation actions, all of which will help us develop more effective health promoting and equitable solutions to the climate crisis. So public health research has an incredibly important role to play across all of these areas. Next slide. I'm going to pass off to my colleague Gaurab and carry on from here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and hope you're all doing well and enjoying the conference so far. And thanks for your engagement in this most critical issue. So I'll continue the conversation here, and here's a little bit of a diagram that helps us organize the different mechanisms. So there's numerous mechanisms. Each of them are complex. We can organize them in different ways, but I have found this organization of the mechanisms helpful. And maybe I'll highlight, in the middle here with the red or the pink circle, mental health really permeates through each one of them. And I think that's important to recognize as well. But, for me in my journey of doing this work of public health and climate change has really taught me that the impacts of climate change hit directly upon all the things that we care about in public health. And so why is health important? Sometimes, when I'm in other spaces, folks say, what's the point of public health folks and doctors getting involved in this? I can't make a solar panel or know, how to get a battery to work better or how to, create some of these clean energy systems that we need. But I'll make an argument that actually we play a very unique role that no one else can really play, and that putting health at the center of this conversation is fundamentally critical. I'll make the argument that we're uniquely positioned to be storytellers, to make this human, to make people care. But health is fundamentally about values and quite powerful ones. And by doing that, I think we can clarify the impact and create urgency. Sometimes people won't react to hearing that a pollutant level is increasing or that an emission graph is showing changes in emissions over time. But when you start putting that human face in front of people and explain the way it's impacting the people and things they love, I think it's a foundation for a moral conversation about how we make a fair and equitable future. And certainly there's this need to have some imagination and kind of dig into the work of transformation, because we do need truly ambitious and transformational change. So I'm a primary care doctor in addition to my public health work. And so I'd like to tell you about a patient of mine. This is our emergency room at our safety net hospital. And I had not met this patient at the time of his first interface with our hospital, but he's a 30-year-old man with asthma who had moved to the United States 5 years prior from Central America. Back home, he was a farmer and had these upper respiratory symptoms. Thought it was a cold, was kind of nagging for a while, but his family was starting to kind of nudge him to get evaluated. He had not established care with any health professionals in the United States yet. But he was a little reluctant to do so, but then started developing shortness of breath, orthopnea, meaning he was feeling more short of breath when he was lying down, headaches, and fatigue. And so finally did go to our emergency room. I think thought he might have had a pneumonia and was hoping for some antibiotics, and had a really devastating and completely unexpected diagnosis. So these are labs, for those of you who may not be familiar with some of these lab findings, evaluating his kidney function. And his creatinine was an extraordinary 11.8, far higher than expected. His GFR was only 5 when we expect that to be above 60. So this was a completely unexpected diagnosis for this young man. And we found that he was in acute on chronic renal failure. He had to be hospitalized and dialyzed urgently. He came to my primary care clinic after this hospitalization. He remains my patient, and I've known him for a while now, and he has written about him with his permission. And really, for me, I met this patient, kind of in my journey of kind of waking up to the impacts of climate change on health. And for me, if there's one patient I've cared for that immediately comes to mind when I think about this, it's him. Now, you could say, well, Gaurab, what is this connection between climate and this kidney disease? He was a young man with so after the evaluation, he was found not to have any intrinsic renal disease. He didn't have diabetes or high blood pressure, which are usually things we think about with chronic disease. Folks who are older and chronic disease can have this, but he had none of those things. And after a very thorough evaluation, he was found to have CKDU, chronic kidney disease of unknown origin, also known as Mesoamerican nephropathy. I think probably the best term here is heat-triggered renal disease. And while the interface of heat and renal disease, this phenomenon, is complex, and there's other factors that are being assessed, like pesticides or other environmental exposures. Ecological studies, my read of the literature, it makes me very confident to say that heat played a major role in impacting my patient's health. And he was a farmer out tending to crops year in, year out since he was a young child. And he was getting dehydrated. He was out kind of putting his body at risk. And with that hypoperfusion of his kidneys, because of not having enough blood flow to it, because of dehydration, his kidneys were slowly getting injured little by little over time. And to the extent that, he was not able to tell that this was happening because his kidneys were compensating until he had a kind of a profound a presentation in the emergency room. And so again, I met this patient at the time I was making these connections myself. He remains kind of one of those faces I see when I think about the impacts of climate change. I won't go in great detail into all these different mechanisms, but this is just to highlight that when we think about climate change and the kidneys, there's complex interlocking mechanisms here of the ways in which ecological change and the changes in our atmosphere impact the interface of a human physiology. Again, I'm highlighting the kind of temperature element here for my patient, but there are many factors at play, including on the delivery of care, not just on the impacts on health. So let's talk more about heat. So this was kind of a case example of heat, and let's talk more about that. It's important to recognize that our body works very hard to maintain a core temperature. And when there is heat stress in our body, our body works very hard to maintain that. Mostly by sweating, we shunt blood flow to our skin to help us sweat off heat that's inside of us. We increase our cardiac output, and so this helps us, maintain that temperature, which is kind of the compass our body is following to ensure stability of our health. But when we are not able to compensate, many mechanisms start getting aggravated and can lose its capacity for maintaining that core temperature. And then some feedback cycles can play out. And so with an increased core temperature, you start having things like cell anoxia and gastrointestinal permeability problems and cardiovascular challenges and inflammatory pathways. And then you can see here how many organs can be impacted by that. And of course, in its most dramatic presentation, this can manifest in heat stroke. It's important for us to recognize that studies have been trying to elucidate the role climate change has on extreme heat. It's believed that up to 37% of heat-related deaths are related to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And that, I think, is quite striking, that climate change is causing such an increase in the rate of deaths. Heat is one of those very intersectional issues. It impacts all the things I care about as a public health person and as a primary care doctor. And I'll kind of provide a couple examples here of the ways in which the impacts of heat on health are widespread. This is a study by Amruta that was showing increased utilization of emergency room mental health services and was able to show an increase in not only mood disorders like anxiety and depression, but substance use disorder, suicidality, schizophrenia. And so when it's very hot, people don't do as well. And then, of course, often it's based on the change from baseline, and there are factors here of how people are able to compensate. But it's important to recognize the impact heat has on mental health. Here's another study by John Jay and a number of investigators that were showing increase in gun violence on very hot days. And interestingly, when communities were increasing their tree canopy to mitigate against the impacts of gun violence, they were seeing fewer shootings. So again, you just see the ways in which heat has these many intersections on health. I want to just make sure I put the framework of environmental racism here at the forefront. Dr. Robert Bullard is considered here in the United States as kind of the godfather of environmental justice, and he defines environmental racism as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages individuals, groups, or communities based on race or color. That includes exclusionary or restrictive practices that limit the participation of people of color in decision-making boards, commissions, and regulatory bodies. And so it's not only about the policy itself, but also who is able to participate in the decision making. And of course, environmental justice is the movement to stop environmental racism. And so these inequities, these kind of processes, these oppressive forces manifest in many different ways across the world and different communities within each country. But there's a fundamental issue of fairness and justice that is at the core of this work of climate change and environmental justice. And using these frameworks help us understand the historical and structural factors at play that have allowed disproportionate health outcomes. Here's one other example is for reproductive health. This is kind of one of those that keep me up at night and really, again, come to my mind's eye immediately when I think about climate change and burning of fossil fuels impacts on health. This was a meta-analysis that came out in JAMA in 2020, showing that there was an increased association between air pollution and heat with premature birth, low birth weight, and stillbirth in the United States. And when they did a subgroup analysis, they found that Black people were disproportionately impacted. Just say a word here about Indigenous health and Indigenous rights and Indigenous frameworks and understanding solutions and ways forward. I found this quite striking, that in the world's Indigenous people, the 370 million Indigenous people around the world, make up 24% of land masses across the world. But in those land masses, only 24% of all land masses make up 80% of the world's biodiversity. And so I'll just make a point here that, certainly I think many of us think immediately about ending the use of fossil fuels and replacing it with clean energy and clean transportation. And that is at the forefront of this work. But this kind of stewardship of our natural resources, writing our relationship with nature, we'll talk a little bit about the role of biodiversity and ecological stability, but it really I believe this work in public health, challenges us. Pat showed you the numbers for food and land use changes on emissions as well, challenges us to do even deeper work of writing our relationship with nature. Because we have been and will be talking about wildfires a lot this week, we'll just make a point here of, climate change and wildfires are kind of one of those interfaces in which many factors are happening at play and kind of create some cascades of impacts. So climate change, of course, increasing temperatures, and this is increasing wildfire risk, which has many health considerations. So what happens is that as temperatures are rising, forests become drier, the soil is not as moist, the snow melts that's critical to hydrating these forests get complex because the snow melt sooner, and the reservoir of the slow trickle down from the mountaintops are disrupted, and that creates the tinder for any kind of major event that could begin a wildfire. And the data is striking. You see here that the average number of wildfires per year has increased significantly over recent decades, and the average length of the wildfire season has additionally increased as well. These are United States data points. And again, we think a lot, there's great concern that the particulate matter pollutants and emissions from wildfires might be particularly dangerous to people's health. This was a nice study by Jen Stowell and Andrea Hanley that showed increased respiratory outcomes here from wildfire exposure. Did not show as much on the cardiovascular front, but did show that there was an increased impact on respiratory disease from wildfire. Just want to say a few more words about climate change's impacts on global health equity, and put again a kind of a global frame to this work. Here on the left, you'll see the kind of warmer red colors show which countries are most responsible for carbon dioxide emissions over time. You can see it's mostly the wealthy countries, the global north, Western countries. And on the right here is a schema developed by Jonathan Potts that shows the disproportionate mortality from climate-related diseases. And you can see that's disproportionately in the global south. And so again, there's a fairness issue here. I'll talk a little bit about this in a second, but you picture families and communities around the world who have done very little to contribute to climate change, and yet they're bearing the burden of this. And they're looking, across the world, asking us how it could be that we continue doing this and leaving their lives in peril when they have very little power to do anything about it. And so my own personal history, my family is from West Bengal, India. And so it's always been kind of important for me. I've been working with nonprofits there, especially one called the Child in Need Institute, since I was a student. And of course, the Bay of Bengal area, both in Bangladesh and West Bengal, in many ways is at the front line of the climate crisis, it's an area that has always been impacted by cyclones, very impactful cyclones. But in recent years, we've been seeing the increase in the Proceeding of National Academy of Science had a major study a few years ago showing that the frequency of super cyclones is increasing. I just saw that there's consideration now creating a new category of Category 6 hurricane cyclones because of the unprecedented power that we're seeing from the impacts of cyclones. And so this was reports coming out for Cyclone Mocha that there was great concern. Thankfully, in the end, it did just move out of the way to not impact the Rohingya refugee community in Myanmar. But I put this slide up just to show these kind of intersecting issues of health inequities. You have a refugee community already having great challenges to have their basic needs met in an area of the world in which there are major cyclones that climate change is exacerbating. And so I think a lot about communities that not only have to face these threats year in, year out, but you see here in 2019, it was Cyclone Fani, then in 2020, Cyclone Amphan, in 2021, Cyclone Yas, and then Mocha last year. it's not, so these cyclones come through and just devastate these rural village communities on the coastlines of the Bay of Bengal. Um, having the events of the disaster and the impacts of that right away, and the devastations on homes and other infrastructure. But even in addition to that, then you have the impacts of the breakdown of health services. A lot of the community health workers that are providing nutritional services to children, trying to get kids into schools and keep them there, it impacts them on many health fronts, impacts their economy. Organizations I've worked with have worked so hard to keep children in schools so that they can have an education when there's this kind of economic devastation. Many of the children are pulled out of school so they can help their families rebuild. And I'm struck that, after that rebuild, they have to face the threats year in, year out into the future. And so we're having this conversation about reparations. We can call it different terms. I was in Dubai for COP28 in December, where the loss damage fund was operationalized with $700 million. We believe it needs many, many times more than that to try to address the loss and damage of the global south. And there's a question, again, going back to these issues of fairness, of what responsibility countries who have disproportionately contributed to climate change have to help the global south adapt and respond. And I will say, make an urgent transition directly to the clean energy resources that are readily available and very cheap now, rather than going through fossil fuel development, as well as many of these countries are developing. Here's a US slide just showing that climate change is very expensive. In 2022, there was 22 $1 billion natural disasters. With climate change, we can expect these kind of events to increase. And I touched upon this, but just a word again about the disruptions to the healthcare delivery system itself. When Hurricane Maria in 2017 just devastated Puerto Rico, here in Boston, many of my colleagues in the emergency room had a very extraordinary experience where they did not have enough IV fluids. And so colleagues in the emergency room were giving patients Gatorade to try to rehydrate them, because there was the major IV fluid factory is in Puerto Rico. And because of the hurricane, there was a shutdown in their services. And of course, within Puerto Rico itself, there were studies showing delays in care and disruptions of care for months on end because of the electricity and infrastructure of the healthcare delivery system. I'm just going to say a brief word about infectious diseases here, a huge topic that we could go many directions in. Of course, mosquito-borne illnesses, tick-borne illnesses, and the ways in which we are redistributing infectious diseases, many issues of migration, and how that impacts infectious diseases. But I'll maybe just make this point. Of course, we're all thinking about pandemics and pandemic mitigation, and of course, the critical role that vaccines play in preventing the spread of pandemics. But I want to make sure that we're not leaping past the point that I believe one of the most critical ways in which we mitigate against the risk of future pandemics is investing in planetary health. And so this conference and many of our conversations is anchored in climate change and emissions, but it's important for us to really embrace this broader work of planetary health. And so when I teach at the public health school and the medical school and show pictures of ecology in our forests and this kind of extraordinary delicate balance we have around the world in our natural world, and the extraordinary species we're around, and just the magnificence of the diversity of our species population, and of course the great crisis we have in those species dwindling. It's actually quite important, I think, to make the connections to human health. And of course, with zoonotic diseases, diseases that start in animals, the more we encroach into natural spaces because of deforestation, because of runaway agriculture, because of misuse of land and water, we are encroaching into natural spaces where these zoonotic diseases may be living in equilibrium with, an area that has immunity to it. But we've seen here that when we when there's a spillover event into the human population without exposure history, how profound the impacts are for public health. And so it's critical, I think, we be thinking in these terms of protecting our planet to be mitigating against future pandemics. So I'll just make this personal a little bit here and just tell you, in my own journey in this work, I'm a global health person. I've been working abroad and for a long time now, but frankly, did not see it all. I was climate change was all around these issues I cared about when I was working for these nonprofits in Liberia and West Bengal, India, thinking about issues of nutrition and safe water and having these coastal communities be safe from events, from extreme weather events and all that. I was not appreciating the way that climate change was right there and impacting all the things that I needed to be working on. And Pat reported out some of the IPCC findings. It was the 2018 IPCC report that really shook me, and frankly, just it was quite a tough process for me to really wrap my arms around how serious, how severe, how urgent the issue of climate change is for all the things I care about as climate change. And so, I toggle back and forth through the different roles I have as a primary care doctor, now seeing the way it impacts my patients in the local community here, as a global health, public health person, understanding its impacts around the world, really embracing the challenge of these issues of fairness and justice. And I think where I've just landed is that we need to have a spirit of transformation and imagination and determination that just because we did things a certain way over all these years doesn't mean we need to do it differently. I think we've got to ask ourselves some foundational questions about what is needed for health, and not just to enter into new spaces where maybe we didn't feel were public health spaces before, but in fact truly are, by thinking about entering into spaces of clean energy transformations and transitions, food systems. Of course, we are in the space of nutrition, but really thinking about food reform and food policy, the health within our homes, within our buildings, not only for ventilation and air quality indoors, but also for the emissions that are coming out of our stoves and furnaces. And again, to really be thinking about forests and biodiversity and the ways in which protecting nature which is a foundational investment in public health. So what are the roles we can play? There's many, and so I'll offer just a few of these, but my greatest hope from your engagement in this program is that you will reflect upon what it is that matters to you. What are the issues that you care about, what you're passionate about, what your skill sets are, what your community is well positioned to work on, both institutionally and your local community. There's something here for every single person. And a message I really try to convey is that this is not about anyone fundamentally changing their work or becoming a different kind of professional. It's really, anchoring on the work that you do, having the skill sets that you have, and bringing that to bear for the climate crisis. And then so what the challenge about climate change is impacts everything in public health. But the opportunity is that everyone has a really opportunity to contribute. But it does take some work to dig into some of these mechanisms and connections and understand how we can be putting a climate lens on our public health work. But here's some I offer this just for consideration and reflection, ways of taking action. Of course, there's the personal responsibility role. My family, we work to kind of get all the gas appliances at our home. We had some privilege to be able to do that and save up for that. And we certainly need a lot of policy and systems change to be able to allow that to happen around the world. Of course, research, teaching, I think that we've got some real gaps that we have across public health institutions around the world of how we're teaching and empowering students to become the next leaders. I really believe in policy. I think there's profound change we can make by making the right policy and having the right leaders guide us so that we can be studying this and having evidence-based solutions be a part of our solution making. I think it's quite potent for public health folks to be writing about their findings. We are all very proud, and it's a great impact to get our work published, and that's of course the foundation of our work, but I think it doesn't end there. It really is communicating and explaining those health impacts to the public forum so that people can understand what's at stake. And then narrative and advocacy. And you'll have to consider what that looks like for you or what that matters. But again, I'll come back to that storytelling work. I believe that marrying the data work, the research work with the storytelling work, we know in the change-making, literature that people don't respond just to graphs alone, that knowing the data is a really important thing. I'm here in clinic today, and we'll be going back to seeing my patients, and knowing the data is my core responsibility. I love data, but telling stories about what we're seeing and why it matters and why it's human, and connecting with people at an emotional level is a really important supplement to that. And I think that public health can be considering how we could do better in those domains. So I'll offer you these questions to consider. What systems do you want to change? What communities do you want to be a part of? Where do you find your power, strength, and inspiration? What roles can help you be most effective? What issues do you want to spotlight? What world do you want to make, and why? Here's a photo here of a piece that was written on our work to incorporate climate change into medical school. We now have a 4-year curriculum there. We're working on the same thing at the Chan School. BU has a really great program in teaching their public health students climate change's intersection with public health. The hospital systems themselves, we're talking about how climate change impacts health, but again, to go back to healthcare delivery, this slide says 10%. Other studies show 8.5% of US emissions are from the hospital sector itself. Here in the United States, HHS, Department of Health and Human Services, has created this challenge for hospital systems to decarbonize by 50% by 2030 and to end all their emissions by 2050 and have a senior executive involved. Public health folks could play a big role in explaining, the health benefits of that. There was this time where I was walking out of our hospital and there was, a shuttle. I was reeling in a wheelchair, a patient who had a COPD exacerbation, finally stabilized. And I wheeled him out to wait for his family, and we were waiting at the curb as the shuttle was just sitting there idling with its engine on, pummeling my patient with a lot of pollution. And so we could be thinking about, how to have sustainable food and clean energy and electric shuttles really be, the way that we do things in the hospital systems. So for me, at least, again, I bring kind of my own experience to this. I think, there is this fundamental piece here of hope and despair, and how to take on big things. We're all seeing these headlines. Many of you live in countries where I'm seeing the impacts of climate change. I'm thinking about the families and communities impacted, and frankly, it breaks my heart. And many of you have undoubtedly seen the impacts firsthand. And we know that these impacts will get worse. We need to be mitigating aggressively and adapting to this. But part of, I think about my grandparents. I told you a lot of my work in West Bengal was inspired by their lives. They lived very tough lives in a lot of poverty, and was able to show up to challenging circumstances and keep going. And I think of them in this work. And so how to see these challenges and still have a sense of courage to show up. I think it's also important to know all the things that are happening. And so for me, at least, it's a little disorienting to see unprecedented impacts of climate change on public health and safety, but also unprecedented breakthroughs in climate solutions. And so here's, in the United States, a slide showing a real freefall decrease in the use of coal, which is continuing to decrease, to the current day. This slide I know is a little bit hard to read, but the graphic I think is important. You'll see the red orangish line that's the biggest slope downwards is a dramatic, unexpected, no one could have thought that solar would decrease. This is a slide about cost decreases over 2009 to 2019. there's like an extraordinary, unprecedented decrease in the cost of solar within 10 years that has completely changed the conversation for the clean energy transition. And then the next biggest slope downwards is onshore wind. And so now renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy across the world. We need to be providing, addressing energy poverty, providing good clean energy across the world, having batteries and the rest to support the grid, to help communities develop economically, but to jump onto the momentum of the clean energy transition. This is a very busy slide. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I'll guide you through it. So this is energy capacities installed. So capacity, like what is being installed as new energy sources. So in 2007, this is a global slide. 2007, 46% of all global energy installations was coal, 21% natural gas, 14 hydro, which is good, clean energy, 10% wind. Fast forward to 2021, and you'll see that 4% of new installations were coal, 11% natural gas, 7% hydro, 25% wind, and look at solar. So you can see from this slide that about 82% of new installations around the world in 2021 were clean energy. I think we can get to the place where we say all of it should be clean energy and that we can be retiring our fossil fuel infrastructure. Here's another schema that I won't go in great detail, but just shows from current day into the future. Green there is solar, nuclear is black, hydro and onshore wind are the kind of red and yellow colors. So you can see that there's many estimates here showing dramatic increases in renewable energy in the coming decades. With the things that Pat were telling you about where we are and how fast the crisis is exacerbating, we shouldn't take any we shouldn't take any we can't get our foot off the gas pedal here, the gas pedal of an electric vehicle, but we've got to keep going. We've got to be working with urgency and use this momentum to keep building on the gains that we've had in the last year. Here, speaking of electric vehicles, is exponential growth on the acceleration of electric vehicles around the world. A lot of this has happened from China. The rest of the world is catching up to some extent now. Transportation, let's just make the point that it's not just about switching from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, but also thinking about active transportation where people can walk and use public transit. But the internal combustion engine peaked in 2017 and has been decreasing ever since and being replaced by electric vehicles and hybrids. And so we can work on these gains to end the use of fossil fuel engines for transportation. Here's another slide showing people's attitudes over time. So on the top here is asking people how concerned they are about global warming. In 2013, you can see the numbers for alarmed and concerned and cautious. And look at how much they've increased till 2022, over 9 years, a significant increase in the number of people alarmed and concerned. And yes, there's still some people who are dismissive or, really disconnected from this issue, but I'll make the argument on the left side of these diagrams show profound, majority of people who really want to get to work on this and put solutions in place. The United States here, Pat made the point of, who has made, the emissions and who has responsibility. Certainly the United States has a long way to go, but in that green line here, the Inflation Reduction Act is a really important policy that was passed recently and promises by this modeling to decrease emissions by 40% by 2030. Paris Agreement that the US has agreed to is decreased by 50% by 2030. And so this was an important policy for that pathway. Say another word about natural solutions. I'm obsessed with trees these days. When I go running, I'm always calling the city of Cambridge here to let them know when a tree is dying or needs. They're probably annoyed by me by these days, but they are actually very responsive, I'll say. But trees have so many health benefits by cleaning our air, by mitigating against the impacts of extreme heat, mental health, physical health. And so we got to be thinking about how the basics that we have available to us can help public health. And there's a lot of major treaties and important things that are being approved that sometimes don't get as much news as they should. You know, this was a major international agreement to protect biodiversity in international waters, to preserve 30% of the planet's land and seas from the impacts of decreasing biodiversity that the UN ushered through in recent years. This is a big deal. And what I take most heart in is that as I see, around the world, climate change is hard to communicate. It's hard to explain when people have, basic needs of their lives day in and day out, right? People are trying to take care of their families and take care of their basic health. To explain to people how heat and air pollution and extreme weather events, infectious diseases, it is actually hard to help connect the dots, especially I will argue, because there are a lot of sources of misinformation out there. And so I see us as ambassadors of health, to enter the conversation and help people see those connections to health, see how it matters to the things and people they love. And look, the students I know that we work with across the world here, I'm sure you all have seen it as well. They get it, they're passionate, they're worried, they're upset, and they're an extraordinary source of power that has really changed the conversation in the last few years and gives me a great deal of hope. There are models out there that show that if we are able to secure and execute on our pledges, that we may be able to abide by the Paris Agreement. But again, there's many factors at play here, and we need to continue on. Here, I'm just wrapping up here, but these are US emissions over time. Pat showed you kind of the global emissions. I'll show you the US ones here. And the light blue are where the United States needs to get to abide by its Paris Agreement of reducing emissions by 50% by that time. And listen, the United States, they in many ways have not had a laser focus on doing this. And even still, you can see that for me, of course, this seems possible. Of course, this seems like we must do it and can do it. I have no other reaction to this slide other than, of course, this is possible. I think of Dr. King's voice that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think it's important for us to feel like we're a part of something bigger than ourselves, that all of us on this webinar, those of us around the world, bringing our talents and skill sets to bear, to pull this arc down, to bring the emissions down, to put health and justice right at the beginning of this work, to know that, we can do our part and that we're a part of something bigger and that we can be making that world that we all deserve. So again, climate can feel very daunting and overwhelming and feel like how could I ever enter into this work? Please consider, reflecting again of how well positioned you are, how it's really at the heart of what you do. And the whole point of this whole thing is to build community together so that we can find our way forward on this journey. All right, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
I think we'll pause for a second. Thank you, Gaurab. That was really fantastic. We're going to pause for a second and take a check in with the questions that have been coming in from the audience before we move on to the transition slides.
Great.
So here's one that I think I might I'll pose it and then I'm going to volunteer to answer it because it's one that I think I might at least get a start with an answer to. In most epidemiologic studies in climate change, the definition of climate change is quite restrictive. For example, air pollution or extreme heat, which are more measurable and acute than our common sense of climate change in a lay people's view. What are some ways to measure the more comprehensive and long-term effects of climate change? I think this person has really put their finger on a really important limitation of the research that we've been doing so far, and it really gets at the idea that we're kind of like the famous drunk looking for their glasses, but only focusing underneath where the lamppost is because that's where they can see. We have certain tools that work pretty well when we have a very restrictive set of data, like one exposure out variable, one outcome variable, and we know how to do those kind of regression analyses. But as you said, as the person said, the climate change exposure are much more complex than that. And that's not just only true of climate change, it's true of a lot of other environmental stresses as well. So I think increasingly we're developing, trying to develop tools that can look at climate more comprehensively. Another aspect of the question was sort of acute, and where climate change is a long-term gradual thing, with acute spikes that occur along the way. But our tools epidemiologically really focus on just the acute part. We don't really know too much about how to look at the long-term changes and how they're impacting health for a variety of reasons, in part because it takes a long time to do those studies. But I think so. Anyway, you've raised a really good point. Maybe I'll ask Rachel if you'd be willing to weigh in about whether and also Amrita, whether the tools that we are now applying are beginning to take into account a more holistic view towards the exposures and outcomes.
My sense is that the methods are there to do this kind of multi-exposure work that needs to be done. I mean, of course, there are caveats to that, but in general, I think the methods exist. It's a matter of getting the data to monitor and measure all of these different things, and even figuring out what all needs to be monitored and measured to try to characterize this. Is my sense is that that's the bigger barrier, but curious if Amrita has other thoughts.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And one of the things that I would mention is that this idea of interrelated hazards, climate relevant interrelated hazards, is one that is very much of interest in the research community right now. And the methods that we have for understanding the risk of exposure to multiple hazards simultaneously is something that I think a lot of different folks are looking at and trying to work on. And it's one of the remaining research gaps that I think is left to be addressed in this area of work.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for pointing out the gaps. The data gaps are especially, that's another aspect, is we only can analyze what we have data for. And we only have data for a few things, unfortunately. So there was another interesting question from Andrew in the chat. This is the comment, and I'll see who wants to address it. Given that environmental racism has the effects that have been shown by Gaurab in his talk, does it follow that environmental ableism also has an effect on climate and health outcomes? So I had to go look up what environmental ableism is. I wonder if Gaurab, if you feel like addressing that.
Sure. I can certainly start off. Look, I totally agree. And what climate, there you can go down the list that climate change exacerbates, the inequities we see. There's issues of power and disempowered and resource and unresourced. And there's in any community that we can organize around and kind of put a framework on, if there are increased, severe weather events that are impacting the delivery of care, that's going to really impact issues of ableism. When you think about the homeless communities, right, of housing, being an issue, that's going to disproportionately people who are not housed. And so we've got these issues in society around the world of how we create resources to support health. We've got obviously a lot of inequities and a lot of structures that are barriers to us doing that as well as we could. And climate change, for me, my analysis of all the studies just show a continual kind of hit on those kind of inequity fault lines. And I'll say on the flip side, if we do this right, we could be decreasing those inequities so much. And so those kind of frameworks, I think, are valuable to help us understand, what's at play here in public health terms.
Anybody else want to talk? Otherwise, I'll move on. There's one quick one, which is, will the slides be shared? And I think Amrita might be able to tell us. I know the recording of this will be available. Are we also sharing slides? I guess in a sense that'll make it available.
I think we can make the slides available after the session, but yes, the recordings for the sessions will also be posted after the conference wraps up.
Cool. And then there's one other question that I think we should move on in the interest of time. But this is a question from Edison, who asked, how can we share lessons learned and good practices about the impacts of climate change on health with public health institutions working in the global south? I wonder if the CAFE program has something to say about that. Amrita, do you want to address that?
Sure. Well, I'm really thrilled that we have this question coming in from a member of our community, because in fact, that's what our Research Coordinating Center is aiming to do, is share best practices across different communities and share resources, share infrastructure, share our understanding of the health impacts of these different climate-related exposures. So hopefully you're able to join for some of the sessions that CAFE is focused on throughout the conference. We're developing methods for documentation, for data reproducibility and transparency through some of the data management resources that we're going to be providing through CAFE. And we're also going to have opportunities to network. We'll have continued sessions such as these webinars. We're also hoping that as part of our capacity building efforts, we'll be able to provide access to additional free or low-cost training materials and resources that people might need in order to build up their research agenda. And then lastly, but certainly not least, we're hoping to have a mentorship network where people who are more experienced in this area of expertise can provide their feedback and their experience to early stage investigators, junior investigators who are looking to start careers in this area. So I think overall, through the Research Coordinating Center, we're hoping to provide access to some of those lessons learned and best practices for communities from all around the world. And one of the other things that I would really encourage is that we have a series of opportunities to provide feedback to our CAFE team. We'll have a conference wrap-up survey. We'll have different opportunities to provide feedback throughout. And we really hope that you'll leverage those so that we can identify additional things that we may not have thought of through this Research Coordinating Center. So we're really happy to have feedback as well from the community joining us. So
yeah,
thanks.
Before we move on, that was a great answer. Thanks, Amrita. Before we move on, just encourage Edison and any other folks who are coming from the perspective of the Global South or LMICs more generally to reach out to us and provide us with input as to how we can be most helpful as we develop the CAFE functions that Amrita just described, because we really want to target it to the needs that have been identified by you all.